Alrighty, we are now going to do some guidelines for thinking about biblical historicity versus archaeology part 2, which was the unplanned part because we only got through half last time, or a little bit more than half. So let's just do a quick review of last time. I know this was like 3 weeks ago. If there are any questions lingering from last time, then maybe you can ask them now, but maybe they'll come up in the middle of the thing. So let's go. So I'm just going to review the objectives. Main objective, provide some guidelines for thinking about biblical historicity versus archaeology. And I want to emphasize, these are guidelines. These are not rules. Okay. These are just like, ways to think, not like specific litmus test. 2, to raise questions and discuss problems which fall within the scope of the general topic without necessarily arriving at answers. Okay. I can't answer all the questions. This is new to me as well. 3, to demonstrate how many hidden assumptions, questionable premises, and unwarranted biases lurk behind claims made by archaeologists and scholars of ancient history, which we definitely did last time and we're definitely going to do today. 4, to leave you with the impression, this is my agenda, that claims made about biblical historicity by archaeologists and scholars of ancient history should be examined with a critical mind before drawing conclusions. Obviously, you should examine everything with a critical mind, but you need to be particularly critical with historians and archaeologists in the sense that you don't treat them the same way you would treat, let's say, like, the results of like a physicist or a chemist or something like that, or a computer programmer or a mathematician. All right. Also, just a reminder that unlike most of my shiurim, which are much more interactive and feel like learning, since I'm not an expert in this, then most of the shiur really is going to be me reading from Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman's book, Ani Ma'amin. And so think of it as like a guided reading, but please interrupt me with questions because that's really where the learning comes from. I forgot if I mentioned this last time. I would have just given the text to you guys, but I feel like reading it and expressing thoughts and questions we have as we go is much more productive for all of us. So that's why I didn't just like give you the text. Okay, so quick review of last time. That's the book, right? Ani Ma'amin by Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman. And then we did Rabbi Gottlieb's book last time, but I don't think I quoted it this time. So we had 6 guidelines. Know why you accept Torah. Absence of evidence doesn't equal evidence of absence. Corroboration equals evidence, but not proof. Remember how speculative ancient history is. That's as far as we got last time. And then the 2 for today are mind the double standard in academia and beware of anachronistic fallacies. So quick review. Number 1, know why you accept Torah. We do not accept Torah because of the historical and archaeological evidence. We accept Torah because of Torah Missinai, because of the proof of Torah Missinai. Or if you have some other reason for accepting Torah, then you should just know why you accept Torah. And as long as you have that clear and you were constantly going back and reviewing it and updating it and answering questions on it, so then your foundations will be solid and will not necessarily be shaken by questions that are posed by archaeology and history. 2, absence of evidence doesn't equal evidence of absence. So this is where we talked about how it's a logical mistake to say, or it's a mistake to say, if there's no evidence for Yetzias Mitzrayim, then that means it didn't happen. Because what you have to do is you have to say, how much evidence could we expect to find for it? And is it reasonable to assume that it could still be true, even though we don't have evidence? And for example, we said that 99% of the papyruses that were written from that time period don't exist anymore, and none of them exist from the area where Yetzias Mitzrayim was said to have happened. We also said that there are many historical events that are accepted by historians, but there's no evidence, because it's not something that would have been left behind. I think we talked about the midbar and how these things wouldn't be left in the midbar. So just because you don't find evidence does not mean that the thing didn't happen. 3, corroboration equals evidence, but not proof. This is just where we talked about how you should note not only when, in other words, if you find things if you uncover evidence that can support the argument, even though it doesn't necessarily prove it. So for example, all of the historical details and trends and geography and names that are used by the Torah and animals that were used and stuff like that do line up with what we know about those historical periods. So that doesn't prove the Torah, but it is evidence and should be taken into account. And number 4, remember how speculative ancient history is. So this is where we did the Motel of the Mysteries, and where that was the children's book where it was a fictional account of discovering a motel room after it had been buried for 2,000 years, and then the archaeologist was theorizing about what all the objects really were. So like he mistook a toilet for an altar, a sacred altar, because it was gleaming white porcelain that the room was centered around, and he mistook a toilet paper for ancient parchment, that you deposit in the altar, So like when you're in modern history or like medieval history, then you could know a lot more. But when you're talking thousands of years ago, then it's very, very hard to know for sure whether the narratives that you're constructing to explain what you find are really based in fact, or whether they're really based in imagination or some combination of both. So that covers what we did last time. I know this was like 3 weeks ago. Any leftover questions on those points that I jogged your memory about just now? Okay, so now we get into some more controversial stuff. I saved the controversial stuff for the last two. The double standard. Okay, we all know what a double standard is, I think, which is when you apply one standard to one thing, and you're supposed to apply the same standard to something else, but you apply a different standard. So let us do our guided reading of chapter 3 of Ani Maamin. Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman says, "Can Tanakh be trusted on anything as a historical source?" Okay, now remember, he's writing for he's not writing, I mean, he's obviously writing for religious Jews, but he's also writing for the skeptics. So this is going to sound like apicorsis because he's trying to address apicorsis here, okay? He says, "Can Tanakh be trusted on anything as a historical source? Should it be considered innocent, i.e. historically accurate, until proven guilty, i.e. erroneous, or guilty unless and until its claims can be corroborated by external sources?" Now, obviously, what do we take it as? We religious Jews.
A historical source.
Right. So we assume that it's innocent until proven guilty, meaning we assume that everything in Torah is historically accurate unless we find something that is not historically accurate. Okay. And then we have to re-examine that. So here's what he says now. As a credible, meaning believable, as a credible historical source, the Tanakh has many strikes against it. It contains materials like the Garden of Eden story that seem frankly mythical in nature. It recounts supernatural occurrences that a modern historian cannot accept as factual, and it regularly describes earthly actions as the result of divine causation. Many of its texts, scholars believe, were composed centuries after the events purportedly documented, and as with the Exodus, few of those events can be corroborated by independent outside sources. So in other words, he's saying, if you are a modern historian and you look at the Torah, you will dismiss the Torah and say it's not historical because of these features, okay? Now, that probably is not a surprise that historians don't accept Torah for these reasons, but I'll tell you what is a surprise. Oh, hold on just a second. In short, the Tanakh in this view is a book of religious propaganda, history that suits its writer's purposes. And the view is well buttressed. Buttress means supported. But it is no less problematic for that, and the reason is simple. Now, this is the shocking fact. Many other historical inscriptions from the ancient Near East and elsewhere are susceptible to the same charge. Okay, meaning if you take documents from those time periods, then which are accepted by historians, then it has exactly the same features as the Torah. So he goes and gives examples. Cuneiform and hieroglyphic texts that tell of divine revelations to royal figures are found everywhere. Overt propaganda on behalf of the kings of yore and the gods they served. Nor can most of the events recorded in these ancient records be corroborated by cross-references to sources from other cultures. Frequently, the events themselves are miraculous. Often the events occurred, if they occurred at all, centuries before the text's date of composition. Many of these characteristics are true, for example, of the Kadesh poem of Ramses II, which he talked about earlier in the book. God speaks to the pharaoh's diadem spews forth fire in miraculous fashion. Hittite accounts of the battle, brief as they are, do not corroborate the Egyptian records. Archaeological excavations of Tel Kadesh have produced no evidence of the battle. So in other words, the Torah, which has these miraculous and supernatural things and doesn't have any corroboration from other sources, is rejected by historians. But these other ancient texts, which have exactly the same features, are accepted by historians, okay? He says, yet to one degree or another, scholars routinely accept ancient Near Eastern texts as historically reliable. Literally dozens of scholars have attempted historical recreations of the Battle of Kadesh on the basis of Ramses' inscriptions alone, meaning that these scholars will treat the one text of this poem from Ramses as historical, even though there's no corroboration anywhere else. Scholars today use the works of Livy to reconstruct the history of the Roman Republic, founded several centuries before his lifetime. And all the historians of Alexander the Great acknowledge as their most accurate source Arrian's Anabasis, which dates from 4 centuries later. So in other words, one of the arguments people make against the Torah's historicity is they say, well, the Torah was written hundreds of years after the event happened. So how can we possibly rely on it? Well, how can you possibly rely on these historical accounts of Alexander the Great or the Roman Republic, which were written hundreds of years afterwards? But they do rely on them. Of course, they exclude the blatantly unrealistic elements, which they peel away from the remainder before crediting its reliability, meaning they don't accept the miraculous stuff. By contrast, however, when it comes to biblical sources, the questionable elements are often taken as prima facie evidence of the untrustworthiness of the whole. So in other words, what this means in English is if they find a miraculous supernatural thing in an ancient Egyptian inscription, they'll accept the historical event and they'll just dismiss the supernatural part. But with Torah, they say, oh, it has something supernatural, the whole thing must be false. Okay, that's what you call throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And now he gives a good experiment. This is a thought experiment, okay? Sorry, not yet. This is all the more remarkable, to put it mildly, in light of one of the significant differences between biblical literature and the writings of other Near Eastern civilizations. And you might have heard this before. Throughout, the Tanakh displays a penchant, meaning a habit of, or a trend or a pattern for judging its heroes harshly and for recording Israel's failings even more than its successes. No other ancient Near Eastern culture produced a literature so revealing a fault, so realistic about the abuses of power, or so committed to recording those abuses for posterity. On this point, at least, there's universal agreement. Yet, in the academic precinct, recognition of this fact has not in the least improved the Tanakh's reputation as an honest reporter of historical events. So I think Rabbi Gottlieb made the point in one of the excerpts we read last time, where he said, if you look at the ancient Egyptian records, you'll find like military victory, silence, military victory. And you'll be like, oh, I guess they only had military victories. But then if you look at the Hittite records from the period of silence, you'll find that the Hittites won and the Egyptians just didn't record it, So again, not that it's dishonest, but like they're recording propaganda, so they're only going to report their successes. But the Tanakh reports arguably way more failures than successes. So if anything, it should be even more believable as an honest record. Yet he's saying that academics don't recognize this. Okay, remember, interrupt me anytime you have questions, because this is like again, guided reading. Okay, but I want it to be a discussion if you have questions. Okay, now here's a thought experiment. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine the Tanakh had never spoken about Hebrew enslavement or of an exodus from Egypt. Okay, so just like pretend that never existed. Sefer Shemos never existed. Okay, instead, a story much like it turned up in a first millennium BCE inscription from a dig in Transjordan, the land of the ancient Moabites. Telling of the earliest period of this people and their deity Chemosh, the inscription reports that the Moabites were slaves in Egypt, but mighty Chemosh defeated Amun and Re at the sea, liberating the slaves and enabling them to set out homeward to Moab, while their enemies perished under a storm of hail. Okay, so this didn't actually happen, but he's saying, let's say they found a document from ancient Moab that said this, okay? In the face of such an account, scholars would assuredly be skeptical of the theological and supernatural elements, but I suspect they would look for clues of an authentic core, especially if there were peripheral evidence of the kind I pointed to above in connection with the biblical account. They would be impressed, for instance, with the story's demonstrable familiarity with Egyptian names, its awareness of settlement patterns in Eastern Delta, and of the correct way of naming Pharaoh, and its cognizance of royal fortifications outside of Egypt, and the geography of the Sinai Peninsula, the Negev, and the Transjordan. Would these hypothetical scholars also pounce on the lack of any mention of Moabite slaves in Egyptian sources? I doubt it. That so many of the account's details accord with our knowledge of the period would lead many to assess the source as trustworthy, especially in the absence of hard evidence to the contrary. The reliability of, so in other words, like this is, again, it's just illustrating the double standard. If they found a document that said exactly a Yetzias Mitzrayim story, but for another ancient tribe, then they would accept it and just say, no, the supernatural stuff is not real. But for Sefer Shemos, they reject the entire thing because of the supernatural stuff. Okay. The reliability of ancient sources, extra-biblical as well as biblical, is a vexing issue. In the previous chapter, I noted that in a wide variety of pre-modern and ancient sources, we find embellishment and imagination layered upon a basis of fact. In any of these sources, where does reality end and the sculpting of events to produce a message begin? These questions are not easy to answer, but from an academic perspective, the Tanakh should be subject to the criteria of analysis applied to other comparable ancient texts. The fact that it is not so treated, that a double standard is in operation, tells us something about the field of academic biblical studies and about the academy itself. Now, here's a shocking quote. There is great truth in the observation by archaeologist and Israel Prize winner Amichai Mazar that, quote, the interpretation of archaeological data and its association with the biblical text may in many cases be a matter of subjective judgment inspired by the scholar's personal values, beliefs, ideology, and attitude towards the data. Okay, now, if you were reading a medical report or a medical study, or if you were reading a chemical analysis, or if you were reading a mathematical paper, a research paper in math, and the results were inspired by the scholar's personal values, beliefs, ideology, and attitude towards the data, you would say this is not reliable. Okay, yet this Pulitzer Prize winning archaeologist, okay, this is an archaeologist, is acknowledging that in the field of biblical archaeology, then all of these biases play a role. Okay, so that's someone from within the field, acknowledging that the field is very, very, very biased. Okay, so that is the message for here: is that there is a double standard in academia, and that when you see academics and archaeologists and historians dismissing evidence from the biblical period, on the basis of like supernatural miracles or on the basis of there not being corroboration, you have to realize that they're not applying those same standards elsewhere. Okay, and there are many other examples. Like for example, I meant to incorporate this into the PowerPoint. You can look it up though. There are many archaeologists. This might shock you. Many archaeologists who hold that David and Melech never existed. Okay, which I guarantee you that if they found ancient texts about a Moabite king from the same period, they would just assume that they're true and that he existed. Okay. Now, I believe maybe 4 or 5 or 6 years ago, they found a seal, like a I don't know if it was a seal like on a stamp or like on a jug from the time period of David and Melech. So that would be evidence, that David and Melech existed, because I think it like had his name on it or something. You got to look at the sources yourself, or maybe they just knew it from other things. But like, what they'll do is they'll say, oh, well, this only indicates that this small area is true. It doesn't indicate the existence of the Davidic monarchy, But again, in any other area, let's say like like some of the wars he mentioned in Europe that there's no evidence of. If they found one artifact, then they would say, oh, this is proof that the entire, period in history happened. So like, it's a double standard. Or another example he gives in the book is he says that at historical conferences, they'll issue like warnings to people who submit research based on biblical stuff and say, now, you biblical scholars, we have to be very objective in our fields. And he says they would never say that to any other like ancient scholar, so like they have a double standard here.
I have a question on that. Yes. So you're saying that like for the Torah, let's say, or for other sources, if they find one thing verified, then normally they would say, oh yeah, like it just shows the whole thing is true. But weren't you saying before, is that correct?
It would not that every detail is true, but it would show that let's say there was a question of, did a certain king exist, and they found an artifact that was verifiably from, a kingship with that name, then they would say, okay, so the kingship does exist, and this happens all the time in ancient Egyptian history because it's so many thousands of years where like, let's say for example, like, they will not know that there was an entire dynasty. And then they'll find one artifact, which is clearly from a new king that it doesn't correspond to anything before it or after. So they'll pause it and they'll say, oh, there must have been another dynasty here. And they'll just, on the basis of that, say that this entire dynasty existed. And then they'll fill in evidence.
How is that different? Because like for the Torah, based on that, you couldn't say like, oh, because you find a coin of David, whole Torah must be true. Like that does show that David's kingdom was actually a kingdom, but it's still like that. It's
no, right. So I'm not saying that that they should take this as a proof of the Torah as a whole. I'm saying that they shouldn't, in other words, the same assumptions of validity and authenticity that they give based on small pieces of evidence from other ancient texts should also be given to Torah. So like, again, like the fact that there is a, let's say like the examples he gave of how the Torah has, the naming conventions of Paro and is familiar with geography and is familiar with like the, like the domesticated animals and all this other stuff, like, and uses the same language and the same names. These should all be taken as like, oh, this is an ancient text, but they're not even willing to say that the Torah is an ancient text. They'll say that the Torah was written many, many years later as a fabrication.
They're saying this should just be like a small detail in support of, like, this isn't the main argument, but like it.
Yeah, I mean, it should be evidence, not necessarily proof, like point number 3, but they should at least treat it as evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay. Now this point, we have a warning here. This is our last point. Okay, it's nuanced, and I think some people should say I shouldn't teach it. Okay, because it's dangerous. But again, the whole premise of this entire topic is you will encounter these problems, okay, in your adult life, in college, on the internet, and I would rather you be exposed to that in the environment of Orthodox Jewish learning, when you can ask questions and like we could have conversations about this, then you stumble it upon your own and then it undermines like your conviction. Okay, so brace yourself for danger. Okay, all right. So I'm calling this beware of anachronistic fallacies. Let's just review our definitions. An anachronism, we said last time, is the act of attributing a custom, event, or object to a period in which it does not belong. So for example, the example I gave last time, the 9th grader asked, what was Rashi's major in college? Unaware of her naive anachronism. Fallacy, we know from English, which is a failure in reasoning which renders an argument invalid. Okay, so she fell prey to the straw man fallacy and rejected her opponent's argument despite its abundant evidence. So what I'm calling an anachronistic fallacy is a failure in reasoning in which a person projects modern ways of thinking into the past, mistakenly believing that people in the past thought in the same way as people in the present. So you are making a mistake in your analysis because you're assuming that the way you think about things is the way they used to think about things back then. And then you apply all the standards of your type of thinking to them. Okay, and I'll give an example of this right now. Actually, I should have incorporated this into the thing. Let's say you tell me that Aristotle was an idiot because he didn't base any of his scientific conclusions based on experimentation. So I would say, no, he's not an idiot. There's no such thing as the scientific method in the time of Aristotle, So for you to hold Aristotle to those standards of empirical studies and like double-blind tests and like placebo and all this other stuff, that's an anachronistic fallacy. You're taking modern standards of evidence and modern rigors of like of the hard sciences, and you're projecting them backwards and saying they should have used those standards, but that's just not what they had, and that's not how they operated. Okay, so here we go. Consider this. If you take all of biblical literature and all of rabbinic literature throughout the Middle Ages, you will not find anywhere a Hebrew term for history. Okay, there's no Hebrew word for history in biblical Hebrew or medieval Hebrew. Of course, you can find innumerable discussions of events of the past, but you will never find these referred to as history. You will never find that one who discusses the past is called that's supposed to say a historian. Okay. Sorry, I scanned this on the airplane. Or consider this even more surprising observation. There is no Hebrew equivalent in biblical or rabbinic writings for the words fact or fiction. Okay, we take fact and fiction as like distinct categories. Like you go to the library and whether you're looking in the nonfiction section or the fiction section, no distinction made like that in biblical or rabbinic writings. Okay, this is astonishing because the rabbis were clearly attuned to the moral values of emes and sheker, of truth and falsehood. When a word in one culture has no precise translation in another culture, it is a sign that the two cultures exhibit not only a lexical gap, meaning a gap in their language, but a conceptual one as well. There's no word and hence no clearly defined concept in biblical and Talmudic writings of a realm of statements or compositions that have the quality of representing fact, as opposed to other statements or writings who receive the downgraded characteristic of fiction. Shocking fact. Okay, I just never thought about this. I mean, it's obvious, but I never thought about it. Okay. The near total absence of the conceptual categories of history, fact, and fiction from the biblical and rabbinic records speaks volumes about how far we as moderns stand from the world of our forefathers during those periods. It means that we are likely to find genres of writing here where these categories appear to us as blurred. When we speak of history, fact, and fiction, we must realize that we are utilizing modern categories of thought. that these are categories that the modern mind has constructed. We think history simply means a discussion of past events with factual accuracy, but we assume that this history has existed for, well, all of history, but it has not. The concept of history itself has a history, and we need to understand how it came to be. Only by doing that can we understand how our sacred sources, biblical and rabbinic, relate to us the events that befell our forefathers. So he is saying we need to understand the history, of what it means to be engaged in the study of history, or what it means for there to be historical text. Okay. So this part I kind of summarize I think this is in my own language here. Okay, he has several pages on this. So he says, what are our assumptions when we read a history book or history text? So here they are, and I'm going to state them on the screen and then say what as opposed to. Okay, we assume that the historian is providing facts together with a scholarly interpretation. Okay, let's say you read a history book and it turns out that the guy wasn't using facts. You probably would reject it and say this is not history. 2, the historian has not embellished his factual account in any way. Okay, let's say you were reading a history book and you found out that when the guy told about World War II, he was really just engaging in pro-American propaganda, and not actually reporting facts, but like he made up details here and there. Okay, you would say, this guy is not a historian. 3, that we assume that there's a difference between historical fact and historical fiction. I don't know how many of you have read historical fiction novels, but when you're reading a historical fiction novel, you are very aware that it is different than a history textbook. Okay, so we have a clean category. And if let's say midway through Mr. Bader's class in history, then he mentioned in passing, he's like, by the way, guys, the thing that we're using for history class is really a novel. You would drop it and run. Okay. 4, we assume that there's a discipline called history that has well-established rules of inquiry that determine how this work was researched and written. Okay, we assume that there's such a thing as like historical research methods and like historical standards. 5, that we assume that the historian has sources which he makes available in some form and is therefore subject to critique and examination by other scholars. So imagine you found out that the history book that you were reading did not cite its sources to you or the publisher. Okay, or you were reading a biography that had no endnotes, that had absolutely no bibliography, no bibliography, nothing that said his sources, you would reject it. Okay, you would say this is not history. 6, you assume that the historian is expected to avoid preaching his own values. Okay, if you found out that this person was not just giving an objective account of history, but is like giving his own agenda, his personal beliefs, you would reject it. 7, that the historian is academically qualified to write such a text. If you found out that the guy who wrote your history textbook was not to insult people who have this profession. Let's say you found out that your whole history textbook was a preschool teacher, okay, who had no historical training, or a stay-at-home mom who likes reading history and then she just wrote a history textbook. Like you would at least be skeptical. All right, you would not assume that they're academically qualified. And we assume that you as a reader of history texts are expected to draw your own conclusions about the implications of the facts and their interpretation presented there. So in other words, when we read history, we read it as they're giving us facts, and then we have to draw our own conclusions about like what to make of it. Like let's say it's a history of World War II, right? So we are expected to let's take the atomic bomb, right? So the dropping of the bomb, if you read a history of the bomb, it's not going to tell you Harry Truman made the morally correct decision to bomb the Japanese. No. It's going to tell us the facts, and we as a reader have to evaluate, was that the right thing to do or not? Okay. So these are all of our modern assumptions. Okay. Now, Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman says, if these presumptions all seem quite obvious, they were not to pre-modern writers and readers. Okay. In other words, before the modern era, all of these points were not recognized or not agreed upon. Okay. These are all modern assumptions. History then and now are alike in name only. In fact, to properly distinguish between accounts of the past that are read today and accounts of the past that were written and read in pre-modern times, we would do well to employ 2 different terms. Okay. In modern times, we read works of history. This history employs all the presumptions laid out above. So in other words, history is all of these guys, all of these premises. Okay. That's what we mean by history. In pre-modern times, however, it would be more correct to say that when people read accounts of the past, they were reading exhortations. Now, I assume that many of you are not familiar with the noun exhortation, so I'm going to define it. Exhortation is an address or communication emphatically urging someone to do something. And I was trying to think of an example that most or all of you could relate to. So the only example I came up with is every year before Purim, the school hires an EMT or police officer to give an exhortation against underage drinking. We're familiar with this from Shahavet. I think many Jewish high schools have these things. Now, would you agree that reading a chapter about alcohol consumption in a medical textbook looks very different than the type of speech that we used to get in Shalhavet before Purim? Yes, right? The speech that we would give before Purim was based on facts, but clearly it had an agenda. Clearly it had a rhetorical purpose, which was to persuade kids not to drink. It was designed to scare them. It was interlaced with religious values and sometimes the values of the speaker himself, right? So that's an exhortation. It's not fiction, but it's not strictly objective nonfiction. It is nonfiction presented with an agenda, okay? So now Dr. Berman goes on, pre-modern writers never wrote with a disinterested aim of chronicling the past for its own sake. Rather, the deeds of the past were harnessed for rhetorical effect to persuade the readers to take action in the present, to believe in the powers of a deity to deliver salvation, to exhibit bravery or other civic virtues. It was expected that writers would not only narrate the deeds of the past, but evaluate them as well, offering praise or blame. The essential nature of these compositions as exhortations leaves us trapped unaware by our modern binary categories of fiction and nonfiction. In other words, we just plug everything and we say, okay, is this fiction or nonfiction? But in the past, not so clear. As one modern scholar of these so-called histories has noted, quote, we have no useful category for the realm inhabited by ancient historical texts. Rather than being literature, the works of ancient historians came far closer to the modern genres of nonfiction novel or popular non-academic history, where a degree of embroidery and imagination is layered upon a basis of fact. And this is, remember, he's not even talking about Torah yet. He's saying all ancient and medieval histories had this character to it. They were exhortations, not modern history. While history and fiction were conceptually distinct in the Middle Ages, medieval accounts of the past are full of what we would today consider fictional elements, invented material, speeches, secret conversations, letters, and battle scenes. Okay, which again, I gotta stress this. Okay, if you read a medieval history book, okay, it would have made up speeches that are reported as though they actually happened. It would have made up conversations and letters and battle scenes, and this was totally accepted, okay? It would include miracles. It would include type scenes where the same ordered sets of activities seem to recur across works, kind of like framing events as though they are patterns, okay? For example, like, I'll give you an example from Tanakh, the story of Yosef and Paro and the story of Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar is what he would call a type scene. It's two different events from different periods, which are told as though they're the same pattern. The Roman historian Cicero claimed that the facts as known to the writers were subject to rhetorical amplification and invention. Now, Cicero is one of the most famous historians, but he's saying, yeah, you can invent stuff and you can amplify stuff. This heritage of classical antiquity remained influential throughout the Middle Ages. Far from detracting from the veracity of a work, plausible fictional embellishments endowed an account with credibility. It made them more believable. Often these embellishments would give an account greater depth, enabling an author to probe the thoughts and motives of historical actors. I think it's supposed to be, this contributed to the value of the piece as exhortation. Such embellishments ensured that the piece would achieve what all assumed was its purpose, to inspire and instruct. This is why many scholars of these materials question whether we can construct fully accurate histories of these periods on the basis of these accounts. So again, compared to the pre-Purim drinking speech, right? If the person says, like, like if EMT says, I have never seen a case where like a person gets into a drunk driving accident and emerges unharmed, right? He's saying that to try to convince you not to drink and drive. If you actually look at the statistics, you probably will find cases where they came out unharmed, but he's not going to incorporate it into his exhortation, because that would defeat the purpose of his speech. One thing that readers did not expect to find in historical accounts of Rome was a detail of the historians' sources. Roman historians were notoriously silent about the sources of their accounts. This further underscores the fundamental truth that these records of the deeds of the past do not represent a sustained effort to arrive at fully factual truth. Rather, they are harnessing they are a harnessing of accepted historical details for the sake of exhortation. History is written for telling, not proving, wrote the first century Roman rhetorician Quintilian. Okay, so this is another reason, by the way, why you cannot expect to find corroboration necessarily in ancient history, because there were not, like nowadays we have historians meticulously writing down stuff that is happening now and keeping their sources and making the sources publicly available. Back then, they weren't even concerned with proving things, and it was still called history. Okay. Pre-modern readers of these works of exhortation also harbored certain presumptions about the authors of these works that differ from those we harbor concerning modern writers of history. Such readers would never have assumed that these writers had special research training that qualified them to compose historical accounts. Livy was trained in rhetoric. Cicero famously described history as a job for a public speaker. In Roman times, there was no systematic study of history and no methodology for doing so. Even in medieval times, history was not a discipline that was taught. There was no option for a student to enroll himself in a course called history or to be examined, meaning tested, in a field called history. Indeed, the first faculty in a field called history was established in Berlin in 1810. So if you said that's supposed to say 1810, not 810. 1810, okay? It is only with the rise of academic discipline of history in the 19th century that the practice of annotation and citation of sources becomes the norm. So in other words, there was no such thing as like the subject of history and historians and historical like qualified authors at all. All right, so where does this leave us? So this is where he makes his point. The books of the Tanakh were written and read along the lines of exhortation. These are works in which a degree of embroidery and rhetorical embellishment is layered upon a basis of fact. The primary interest of all books of the Tanakh is to bring Israel to greater covenantal piety in its relationship with the Almighty. The Tanakh assumes that the readers and listeners approach the biblical text in submission, meaning that they accept it, with a desire to learn its lessons. The Tanakh assumes that readers leave it to the divinely inspired authors of the text to determine the most effective way to cast the events of the past in order to transmit its lessons. Okay, in other words, Tanakh is assuming that you accept. The Tanakh is not trying to establish itself as a historical document by modern standards. So if you, as a modern person, try to hold it to those standards, you are the one who's making that mistake, because that's not what the Tanakh was trying to do, and that's not what any ancient or medieval historians were trying to do. Okay, Tanakh assumes that you are accepting all of the facts as factual, and its goal is to frame those facts in a way to achieve its goals, which is to persuade you in beliefs, to give you good midos, to instruct you in halacha, to tell a certain story about Klal Yisrael that gives us a certain view of ourselves in relationship to Hashem. So it's not trying to be a historical book, okay, even though it is based on history. This can be very threatening, and here's the dangerous part. This can be very threatening for some on religious grounds because it suggests that some aspects of the biblical accounts this is another scanning mistake, are not fully factual, but rather rhetorical. But this is threatening only if we allow ourselves to fall into the trap of buying into what our not modern environment tells us. Sorry, our modern environment tells us. Yeah, sorry. Again, you got to remember that this was on the airplane, and also I did not have a charger at the time to go back and fix this. So my apologies for the typos here. The environment we live in tells us that the more factual an account is, the truer it is, and hence the more valuable it is. Okay, that's an important thing. I should have highlighted that we are used to saying the more factual something is, the truer it is, but that's not the case in ancient times. By contrast, the Tanakh and indeed the entire rabbinic tradition proceeds on different traditional assumptions, a different tradition of assumptions. Ooh, this is bad scanning. The Tanakh is a valuable account of the past, not because all accounts. Oh, I'm sorry. This is really bad. This page must have been really bad when I scanned it. The Tanakh is a valuable account of the past, not because all of the accounts it records is fact. It is a valuable account of the past because of the divine authority behind it. It is valuable because it casts the events of the past in a way that ensures that we come away with the most important messages that those events have to teach. Our modern environment tells us that we should read the news or learn about past events and then process the facts for ourselves, determining the meaning on our own. Our sacred sources insist that we come to the sacred text in submission with a belief and commitment that this alone is the best way to understand the meaning and lessons of the events that are portrayed. This is how God has authorized that we relate to these events. Okay, So I want to give you an example. I know we're almost done here. An example that we are familiar with because we just did it, okay? And the text here comes from allatorah.org, but the example is the Mabul, okay? So allatorah.org says, flood stories have survived in many cultures from Central American Maya to the Hindu in India. The closest parallels to the biblical account, not surprisingly, are the Mesopotamian versions. These are similar to the biblical story, not only in the general concept of a divinely wrought flood wiping out mankind, but also in many of the particulars describing the event. It is the differences between the versions, though, that are the most telling, as they highlight the unique values and belief systems of the children of Israel, distinguishing them from their polytheistic neighbors. All right, fine. So what are examples? So here are 3 Mesopotamian accounts of the flood. The famous one is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is found in the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The hero of this account is Utnapishtim, or Finder of Eternal Life. Another one is the Epic of Atrahasis. This version is also Babylonian in origin. It has survived several fragments, but the oldest and fullest known copy dates to the 17th century BCE. Another one is the Epic of Ziusudra. The Sumerian account focusing on the hero Ziusudra is known from a single fragmentary tablet excavated at Nippur dated to the 17th century BCE. The tablet contains an account of both creation and the flood, and is sometimes called the Eridu Genesis. Now, if you go on allatorah.org and you click on table, it'll show you a table comparing the different elements of these stories. For example, who is the god in the story? So in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's so-and-so. In the Sumerian version, it's so-and-so, and in our version, it's Hashem. Who was the hero of the story? Utnapishtim in their version, Noach in our version. What's the reason for the flood? So in one of the, I forgot what they are, but let's say in one of the things, it was that that mankind was too noisy. Okay, I think that was one of them. Or let's say hypothetically, another one is that the men were getting too powerful and the gods were threatened. In ours, it was Hamas. That there's too much Hamas on the earth, okay? So the question is, what do we make of these different accounts of the Mabul in light of Dr. Berman's principle, okay? Like, there's different historical accounts. What are we supposed to do? So the answer is you have to remember to not judge them as modern history, okay? If you judge these accounts by the standards of modern history, you would view the differences as reflecting either lies or inaccuracies. You would say, well, was the guy named Utnapishtim or was his name Noah? Was it like, what did the flood cover, this or that? But if we view these as exhortations, events of the past that were recast for rhetorical purposes, then obviously there will be differences, okay? Each culture will tell the story in a manner which furthers its own beliefs, values, and agendas. So what this is saying is it has a factual basis. There was a flood that destroyed a civilization, but the Babylonians are obviously not going to draw the same moral implications as we do. They're going to say that that the person who it happened to was someone in their ancestry, right? Whereas we treat Noah as our ancestor, even though he's not from Klal Yisrael, but we treat him as our ancestor. And we're going to say, we're going to harness, the Torah is going to harness this for our purposes to promote the values of not doing Hamas and Gilui Arouse and Avodah Zarah. So that's a good example of exhortation. And furthermore, if the Mabul was not global, as we demonstrated earlier this year, why did the Torah tell it as if it were a global event? Isn't that misleading? Now, some of you might have wondered this when we did the Mabul thing. So the answer is what Dr. Berman said. It would only be misleading if we judge the Torah by the academic standards of modern history. So in modern history, if it said that the flood was over the entire earth, so then and we find evidence that it wasn't over the entire earth, so then that disproves the story. But if we recognize that the account of the Mabul is an exhortation, then it makes sense that the Torah would tell the story of the Mabul in the most effective manner possible. In this case, by emphasizing that all life on earth was destroyed, even though it was only the people and animals in that particular civilization. Just like an EMT who gives you a anti-underage drinking thing will say that, like, if you drink and drive, you will get permanently harmed and like go to jail or something like that. It doesn't mean that every single, factually speaking, that's not strictly speaking true, but he's emphasizing something for rhetorical effect. So that is the 6 guidelines, and I actually added a 7th, but in case I had extra time. Why did I think I'd have extra time? But this is really points that we made before, which is remember, lo tasuru achar levavichem v'achar einechem, is that any line of thinking that causes you to uproot one of the foundations of Torah, it's usher to think about. And it's not usher intrinsically to think about. It's usher because if you have a deficient mind and you think that you're capable of arriving at the truth in a certain area, but you're not trained to do so, then it can be dangerous. So just a reminder that if you confront questions like this and you are not trained to be able to answer or to navigate like those subjects, then don't go into those areas until you're ready. You got to know yourself and stay on guard against denying these ikarim. And with that, we get to the beep of the watch. Okay, and the shiur is over. As usual, I'll take questions that you have, but you're dismissed if you're done for today.
Thank you. Have a great Shabbos.
Have a good Shabbos.
This makes sense. I feel like in like archaeological context or like historical context, but I feel like as Jews, I feel like it's a little bit lacking because it seems to be saying that back then everyone wrote like this.
Yeah.
Kind of like diminish like the Torah being special and from God because everyone wrote in this way.
Okay, good. I'm glad you made that point.
Standard.
So Dr. Berman actually leads by addressing that point, and he says he shows examples where this is actually coming up in a couple of parshios, where so you're familiar with the phrase "Dibur Torah k'lashon b'nei Adam," right? That the Torah speaks in the language of man. Now we say that to mean that like the Torah will describe God in physical terms because that's what we understand. But Dr. Berman brings proofs from the Rambam and the Ralbag and maybe one other person that not only does the Torah speak in human terms, the Torah used ancient literary conventions and wrote in the ways that they wrote back then, because that was the most effective way to communicate. And the example the Ralbag gives is really good. You guys, are you familiar with Parshas Vayakel and Pekudei? What makes those parshios unique? If you've ever had to give a Dvar Torah on Vayakel or Pekudei, anyone know what I'm talking about?
Are they like the repeat of the Mishkan stuff?
They're the repeat of the Mishkan details. They're the most boring parshios in all of Tanakh. There's almost no Rashi because it's almost just a repeat. So basically you have Teruma and Tetzaveh, which is telling you how to make like the Kalim, and then you have Vayakel and Pekudei, and it just walks through all the steps again. So Rabag asked the question, why would God include this? And the answer he gives is he says, and I would find, actually, I'm not at Lomdeha. I have my books right here. Hold on. He says, oh, if you ever want to know what Rabag to use, the green Rabag is the Rabag to use because it's the most accurate and it's got good footnotes. Oh, you know what? I just realized, hold on. I thought I highlighted it last time I did it. Maybe I didn't highlight it. I'll just quote you the Ralbag. If you're interested in the source, I could give it to you later. Ralbag says that it was the style in those times to go into elaborate detail when describing like palaces and sanctuaries, and it would make people have like greater awe for the Mikdash to do it, So, and the analogy I give is like, I don't really know what popular magazines are, but let's say like when you go to the grocery store, like Stop and Shop, there's like, People and like Us and let's say it, there it describes in detail all of the drama and like styles and fashions and stuff of celebrities. So if you took a magazine like that and you put it into a time period in the past, they'd be like, who cares about like the Kardashians, But for a modern reader cares about it. So to answer your question, Elisheva, is to us, it diminishes the Torah by saying that it was written based on the styles of the times back then. But the Ralbag's point and the Rambam's point when he makes this also is that it actually enhanced people's appreciation for the Torah and their conviction in its truth because it was writing in a normal, in what was like a conventional way. And if it didn't write in that way, so then people would look down on the Torah because it was some alien sort of like style, like that didn't have anything to do with anything.
Yeah.
But yeah, that worked back then, but now we're kind of having the same problem that we were trying to prevent.
Right. And that's really what Dr. Berman is trying to do with his book as a whole, is he's trying to say that if you really understood what the Torah was trying to do, and if you learned about how, if you learn examples of these ancient texts, it would give you greater appreciation for the Torah. Okay. And in fact, this is a cool thing. While I was in Seattle, Dr. Berman was touring Egypt. And every day and this is the first time he had been to Egypt. So every day he would post pictures of what he saw like in the pyramids and show how like it explained like and shed light on certain things that the Torah said. For example, and by the way, this was during the time I didn't have my charger, so I didn't really read a lot of stuff because I didn't want to read on my phone every day. So the one example I saw was he showed a picture of in fact, hold on just 1 second. Let me just let me just see if I can get it on my computer really quickly. If I can't, then I'll just tell you about it. Dr. Berman, I follow him on Facebook. Joshua Berman, and does Joshua Berman. Here we go, and let me just see. Yeah, hold on. Yeah, okay, good. This is the example. Okay, so let me just share here. Hold on. Okay, so this was a picture he posted, and he says, I got to move this thing out of the way. Hold on. He says, on the final day of my trip to Luxor, I gained insight into the Torah's account of brick making as the focal point of the enslavement, while in the tomb of one Rekhimeri, a local governor in charge of the public works in Luxor under one of the pharaohs during the second period of servitude. Rekhimeri's tomb featured depictions of various stages of the work he oversaw: tanning, carpentry, winemaking, and brickmaking. Brickmaking in this depiction is assigned to prisoners of war and is at the bottom of the register. It is the lowliest, hardest work. The register depicts 5 stages. You can see them all here. Okay, here's another picture. Drawing water out of a reservoir, pouring into the trough, mixing the mud either with a tool or by trotting in it, pouring it into wooden frames to attain form, setting the bricks out to dry in the sun, schlepping the bricks to the site where they are needed. By far the most attention in this register is devoted to the schlepping of the bricks. Look at the picture below. At the bottom left, a slave strains to lift the double load of brick that will be suspended from both sides of a pole that rides across his back. Okay, that's the pole there. In the center, another man has managed to straighten up and begins to walk. At the right, another man balances a heavy load on his head. Immediately behind him is a taskmaster with a stick or a rod. At the top left, seated, is another taskmaster with a stick or a prod. Prior to the admonishments in Leviticus 26, that's the Torah, Hashem promises, I am the Lord your God who brought you out from the land of Egypt to be their slaves no more. I have broken the rods of your yokes and have made you all walk erect. Rashi and Rashbam interpret rods to be something that holds together the yoke of a draft animal, and the yoke here is Israel's experience of the enslavement generally. But note that the verse is entirely in the plural. Hashem broke the rods of each and every person, not a metaphorical yoke of the bondage of all. I wonder whether motos ulchem refers to the rods that slaves shouldered to carry the double load of bricks as depicted below. And when you look at that slave in the lower left, you can well understand that the paired opposite to the rods of the yokes is the deliverance of I have made you walk erect. So I thought that was a pretty cool thing. And the reason why I'm bringing it up now is because Rabbi Berman's whole approach is the more you understand about ancient cultures, the more you appreciate the truth and beauty of what the Torah was saying. And the same thing goes for literary conventions, is the more you realize how ancient texts wrote, the more you'll realize what the Torah was trying to do. And even though it's different from what our modern standards are, you'll appreciate how God was like speaking to the people in ways that they could hear. And the only reason he's not speaking to us that way is because there's only one Torah given, and like, God can't reveal himself to us again. And that's why we need Nevi'im, because the purpose of the Nevi'im was to speak to each generation in their language, not to give the mitzvos differently, but to translate the Torah into terms that people can understand in their own like language. And that's also the purpose of Chachamim nowadays, that like, when Rav Soloveitchik quotes, modern philosophers and like, and Rav Lichtenstein uses literature, and Rabbi Jonathan Sachs quotes like popular culture, they're translating the Torah into terms that apply to us. The only difference is they're human, and Hashem did it like through divine knowledge, and he did it really, really well in Torah, but we can't modify the Torah for those things. So I don't know if that satisfies you, but that's my answer to your question, is that like the more we learn about those ancient literary conventions and archaeological evidence, the more we should theoretically appreciate Torah and its truth.
I like that, but if you're thinking about Torah, a lot of the like proof and like the validity of it comes from the Torah itself.
Yeah.
Certain historical accounts like Sinai, like that's so fundamental for believing in Torah. And if you're going to say that the stories, like the historical stories in Torah, shouldn't be immediately accepted as true because it's not that type of account, then what does that do to like the validity of Torah?
Just to clarify, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that that exhortations are based on a historical core, but not all of the but there is such a thing as embellishing details. Okay, so in other words, we maintain that all the events of Torah actually happened. Okay, like that with the exception, let's say, of like if you hold that Gan Eden as a mashal, Gan Eden I think is the only exception, but all the events of the Torah happened. And we accept them because of the proof of Torah Sinai, which does not depend on anything Joshua Berman said. That was the first principle, So Sinai is not touched, but I'll tell you what might be touched. Okay, and this is an example here. Is and Joshua Berman goes into an example of this. Like he says, let's take in Sefer Yehoshua, Rachav talks to Kalev. Okay, when they sneak in and when they spy in. Okay, and she has a whole discussion. So Dr. Berman goes and he shows how like it is very, very unlikely that the discussion as reported by Sefer Yehoshua took place word for word. And he brings proofs of this because the stuff that she says is not something that a Canaanite woman would say. He has a really, really good argument about it, So what Joshua Berman would say is, yeah, the invasion of Israel by Yehoshua happened, but did the detailed word for word discussion like happen as historical fact, or is that embellishment that the Torah is saying for their purposes, for the purpose of Torah? Or here's another example that even though you don't agree with that, I'll give you another example. Moshe talked with Paro a lot, right? Do you think that the words reported in the Torah are the only words that were said between them? Obviously not, right? Because they clearly talked like human beings. It's not like they said Moshe said one sentence and the Paro said another sentence and they were done. Like they clearly had a lot more discussion, but the Torah is depicting the narrative much like a historical novel. Let's say a historical novel that would talk about what George Washington said to his men before they crossed the Delaware. Like we might have an actual text of the speech, but then there might also be like embellishments that are told in a way that is like to for rhetorical effect. That's what he's saying that the Torah will do as well, is that there's that not all the details are said, like let's say here's another example, the giants, right? Like that there were giants in the time of Noah, so I'm sure in ancient times, they thought that these were literally giants. We now know enough about physiology that it is literally impossible to have a giant human being because they'll die. Okay. So why did the Torah say giants? Because they were probably very big, strong people, like football players or something like that, and the Torah wants to amplify the fact that these were powerful men who were going and stealing all the women, so it calls them giants, so that's the type of thing. So my answer to your question, Leah, is the core historical events. First of all, Torah Sinai we accept because of the proof of Torah Sinai. We don't accept it based on the text. And then even in the text of the Torah, with the exception possibly of Gan Eden, then we hold that all of the historical narratives in the Torah are true. It's just that the particular details might be said as exhortations and amplified.
So why would then we be like concerned if people do or do not have like a academic bias about Torah if we know that it's just like an exaggeration?
Because the academics are denying the existence of the historical facts themselves, like the historical core. Meaning the academics say that there was no Exodus at all. Okay, meaning saying that the Jews that their bread didn't have time to rise. That is a detail, and we will not be bothered if the fact that they rejected that. But they denied that there were ever Jews in Egypt. They denied that there was an Exodus. They denied that there was, a crossing of the sea. They deny like the entire thing. They deny us wandering around in the Midbar. So that's why we are concerned with that. Okay. Now, I'm sure you'll have questions about this going forward, but as questions come up in the year or like even after the year, then, let me know and I'll address them because like I said, I'm learning about this for the first time as well. And I think I need to educate myself in this, because this is where, Rambam was facing the threat of Aristotelian philosophy. Rav Hirsch was facing the threat of the Enlightenment and like secular Judaism. We face the threat of the of what do you call it, of modern academia and the and archaeologists and historians. So like that's why I want to educate myself in this as well.
Wait, I have a question.
Yeah.
So I remember like in the very beginning we were discussing this, like not today, the other day we were doing this. You were
Yeah.
saying something about an article about like the chariot wheels found like in the scene
Right.
somewhere, and then you were saying how, I'm not sure if I understood correctly. Is that true, or is that
No,
not?
that was so that I led with because that was a totally made up story by a satire
Like,
site.
that never happened?
No, that didn't happen. It was the if you go to Snopes.com and you look up like chariot wheels, so then it'll say that it was from an actual satire site, and on the site it says that their articles are not true, but then someone picked it up and then it started being spread around as if it was a true story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
And it happens every couple of years. Like I've seen it make its rounds like multiple times,
Mhm.
Yeah. Alrighty, anything else before we end for today? Okay, so hopefully this is useful. And I don't, again, that the book itself, the Joshua Berman's book, I wouldn't say that I recommend it for all of you now, but know that it exists. Okay, and if you ever, let's say, do take a course on like biblical history or something like that, then I would say you should read the book. And like, because I just gave like the outlines, but he has, the real power comes from his example after example after example and like detailed stuff. So I think it's a worthwhile book. Alrighty.
Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you.
Have a good day.
Happy Shabbos.
Have a good Shabbos.